You cannot yoga or meditate your way out of burnout.
Oftentimes people are kind of shooting in the dark. And I feel like when you approach it from the lens that you're doing within these organizations, people realize they're not alone. And we as a team can redirect the course. Welcome to What's Possible, a show for high performers who want to take their leadership, well-being, and overall life satisfaction to the next level. I'm Eileen Schaefer, and today we are looking at well-being through a team lens. With all the uncertainty in the world and nonstop shifts in our work environment, our well-being is at risk. Leaders are constantly being asked to adapt, pivot, step up to the plate, often with fewer resources. Not surprising, individuals and teams are exhausted, mentally and physically. What if we had the ability to change this scenario? What might be different for you or your team if you knew the warning signs of burnout? Good news, there are proactive things you can do to create a fertile ground for greater well-being. I invited Giselle Timmerman, an expert in well-being and creator of the Wellbeing Team Lab, to share how we can pave the way for a healthier future. Giselle will help us answer these two questions. How can looking at well-being through a team lens improve engagement, productivity, and overall success? And what are the most important steps you can take to foster a culture of well-being? Giselle Timmerman was part of the inaugural master's program in applied positive psychology at the University of Pennsylvania, where she studied the science of well-being under thought leaders, including Martin Seligman. She is an SBC coach, a consultant, trainer, and professor in leadership and well-being. Welcome, Giselle. I'm so happy you're here.
Thanks for having me.
Well, and thank you for being up late. You're calling in from your home in Barcelona. So I'm curious, you are, I think, one of the youngest who have ever gone through the program at Penn in applied positive psychology. And what drew you to that program? It was the inaugural year. You certainly didn't know anyone who went through. What brought you there?
I was double majoring in psychology and sociology at NYU, and my senior thesis was on wealth and happiness. And so I stumbled upon Ed Diener's work. He is really founding father of positive psychology as well, although Marty gets a lot of credit. Ed Diener came up with that term, subjective well-being. And so I just dove into his research, and he is what drew me to the program. But then someone had said, I don't know, experimental first year, you might not want to do that. So I said, okay, maybe another time. I got a scholarship to do IO psychology at NYU. But then the day before the applications were due, I just thought, no, I got to go for it. I have no clue how this is going to impact me professionally, but I knew that it would impact me personally. And fortunately, it's done both. It took a while to figure out the professional front in terms of how I would apply it. But of course, it changed the course of my career and my life. So very well worth that last minute decision.
Gosh, talk about trusting your gut and having it really work out for the best. Well, and it's hard when you have people who are saying, really, are you sure you want to do this? And again, when you don't know anyone who's gone through the program, it's not inexpensive to go get another graduate degree. You do want it to be purposeful, meaningful, and get what you hope out of it. And then to go in not quite sure what you want to get out of it, that's a lot of trust.
It is. And, I have my dad to thank. He's an entrepreneur. He's always been my biggest champion. Definitely without my dad, I wouldn't take many of the leaps that I have. And I think knowing that I would always be creating a career that perhaps didn't exist helped with managing some of that uncertainty. I knew I'd be charting into unknown territory no matter what degree I chose. So I think I was, managing my risk just a little bit by going to an Ivy League. When you graduate with a degree, no one has heard of, not the easiest job application process, but I was interviewing at big consulting firms. And I remember being at this interview in New York, where they put you in a hotel, you go through this battery of case studies, interviews. And the feedback I kept getting was, Giselle, you seem really interested in our pro bono work. And I took that feedback to heart and actually started focusing on social impact consulting. So working for companies that have a social purpose. And so I did great work working in a phenomenal boutique agency in Los Angeles for about 8-9 years. So doing strategy consulting, financial pro formas, organizational assessments. But the work I loved was helping to facilitate these conversations and then equip the leaders to be managing change to implement the strategy. And that's where I started really experimenting and playing with a lot of what I'd learned in positive psychology, such as appreciative inquiry, coaching skills for leaders, managing through change, building high-performing teams, high-quality relationships. Thanks to that experimentation, I then got to kind of branch off and start my own company where I focus on supporting leaders and their teams in building high-performing team cultures. And so it's been this mission. The through line, if you will, has been this mission of equipping leaders with evidence-based strategies and tools to help raise team effectiveness, but also motivation and resilience. I want people to do well and also be well at the same time.
Yeah, and that's a huge differentiator. I would say that evidence-based tools, oftentimes people are kind of shooting in the dark, trying to figure out, well, let's try this, let's try that. And I think that's one thing that's quite powerful when you apply positive psychology to an organization is you are using evidence-based tools.
Yeah. And to be honest, when I graduated in 2006, there were not a lot of evidence-based tools that you could apply in the team setting. A lot of it was individual interventions. I didn't have a lot of resources for that for quite a few years. So thanks to the researchers, there's a lot more that I can lean on now.
Let's dive into that actually, that whole team approach. We often look at well-being as an individual. It's all about the individual typically. And you've turned that a little bit on its head. I know through SVC, we offer the Wellbeing Team Lab for our organizations who want to bring us in to look at it through that team lens. Before we really kind of swim in this territory, can you explain what you're even talking about when you talk about it being a team sport?
So interestingly, I do think it has become somewhat of an individual leadership responsibility to care about well-being of our team members. And I think after the pandemic, we've really realized that you cannot yoga or meditate your way out of burnout. Even taking a sabbatical is not going to do it. Burnout fixes change from organization to organization and team to team. And so I think we've really shattered that myth that burnout is solely due to poor coping strategies on the individual's part. There are a lot of other variables that cause burnout. So I think that we have to know and address these factors via, of course, our individual choices, still really important, but also our team culture to prevent burnout and recover from it. So it's really taking more of a systems approach towards burnout because by some estimates, we do 80 to 85% of our work in teams. Right. So it's kind of a systems-based intervention, well-being as a team sport. And we also know from the research, as I mentioned, thank you, researchers, high quality teamwork is associated with higher well-being and resilience. In other words, the way an individual team handles stress or challenge is going to influence the well-being of its individual team members. And we also know that team members that support people's well-being have higher performance. So it's bidirectional.
Yeah. So you get that double effect when we're working it from both ends. You know, we might say, oh, well, thank goodness, at least I'm going on vacation. Well, a week vacation and then you come back into an environment that isn't healthy is not going to do much for you. And so what you're talking about is really changing the system, the environment that people are working. And I'm going to say working and living in, not just working in.
The factors that contribute to burnout are things that we can feel in all aspects of our lives. But I think that because work is such a big part of our identity and where we draw a lot of meaning, where we have a lot of our relationships, that we have to focus on the work aspect in conjunction with, of course, our personal lives. You know, I think you mentioned vacation is not going to prevent burnout. At the same time, you know, this podcast is for high achievers, high performers. The thing is, when we look at burnout in organizations who are most at risk, it's actually the folks that are most highly engaged. which I think is really counterintuitive because a lot of organizations will say, oh yeah, we use this assessment tool, we're tracking engagement. And look at all these people that are highly engaged. And I say, wait, did you know that the people that are in that highly engaged sprinting zone, that is the sneakiest path to burnout. They're 60% more likely to burn out. It creeps up on them. I have personal experience with this. We can't use engagement as a proxy for high well-being. It can take other people to be like, hello, how you doing there? How are you managing these things? Because we don't necessarily know when we need to be taking care of it ourselves. I think we can try to do the individual coping strategies, but we also need the relationships to be helping us calibrate where we're at and then to help us put into place some of the support that we might need.
Yeah. I'm taking out a fluorescent highlighter. High engagement does not equal high well-being. And I think we miss that so often, and also high enjoyment doesn't equal high well-being. Just because I love my job, I can still burn out.
And I was actually there when I talked about that consulting job I had. It was fantastic. I was on a really small team. I had so many of the right ingredients. I loved my job. I was learning, I was growing. It felt high impact, really meaningful. I had a lot of autonomy. I was definitely highly engaged, but I was also burning out. I was working every single weekend. I love the women, the leaders that I worked with. I'm still close to them today. I was in that sprinting zone. I couldn't push back on the workload. And I was having chest pain. I went to the emergency room a few times. And I remember one of my managers saying, well, gee, I hope it's not the work environment, like a joke. And I wanted to be like, well, I need some help. But I wasn't in a situation where we created space to have those sorts of discussions. So that's what the well-being as a team sport idea also helps to create space. It gives some nomenclature to how to talk about these things so that when we do need help, we can raise our hand.
Can you just give a general framework of when you're walking into an organization and you're doing this well-being as a team sport and bringing people in on that concept? Give us an idea of what that looks like.
It might look different depending on the team that I'm working with, but when I'm supporting leaders and their teams, because it's always the leader and their team, there's often even some leadership coaching as a component of the team workshop or workshops. But there are 3 areas I think are really important: recognition, recharging, and relationships. So recognition is all about what burnout looks like, its symptoms, if you will, and more of its root causes. But on the other end of the equation is thriving at work. And there are different drivers that are going to help us feel a sense of thriving that are different from the root causes of burnout that are going to pull us down. This is a really important concept. This is, what positive psychology helped us to understand. In our lives, when it comes to health, for example, we know that what you need to do to get better when you're sick is going to be different than what you need to do in order to have high optimum levels of health. It's the same with well-being at work. You need to manage some of the root causes of burnout and prioritize some of the drivers that really help to boost your well-being. So that's the recognition part. And looking at those demands that can cause burnout and also the resources we have for thriving. And as I mentioned, giving the team a common language and some actionable strategies for saying, hey, this is what's important to me at this point in my career, right? At the momentum that I'm going at. And it's going to look different for you, right? So Eileen, it might be having a high impact or receiving feedback. For someone else, it might be having autonomy and decision-making authority and a sense of recognition. The second thing I think that leaders and their teams need to focus on are recharging. So that's why I love at SVC and our coaching engagements, we always include actions for well-being, right? Those 4 types of energy we need to be managing. This is oftentimes common sense, but not common practice on teams. So for example, some teams will say, oh yeah, we have 25-minute meetings or 50-minute meetings so that people can recharge in between Zoom meetings, right? We're managing Zoom fatigue. And then I say, okay, what are you doing in those 5 or 10 minutes? And I'm like, well, I'm checking email or Slack. No, that's not recharging, right? So do you have team norms about what it means to take a micro break in between meetings, for example, or team norms around where we create boundaries, such as no meetings on certain mornings of the week in order to protect time for deep work or flow? That's recharging at the team level. And oftentimes it results in a conversation around team norms. And this is so important, especially for hybrid or remote teams. And then the third aspect is relationships. You know, Eileen, and I'm sure a lot of the other folks in the podcast have talked about the greatest study that positive psychology has contributed, which is other people matter. When we look at what accounts for happiness and meaning in our lives, it's the quality of our relationships. And at work, we know that there are specific team competencies that have to do with our relationships that are predictive of team resilience, engagement, and thriving. Things like we trust one another, we're able to have difficult conversations, we're able to pivot, we focus on learning and growth. In the team wellbeing labs, we always assess where teams are at in these areas. So then we can say, hey, this is where we're doing really well. Let's keep these strong. And hey, this is where we need to do better. So one of my most beloved clients is Vistaprint, now called Vista. And their data and analytics organization was rapidly growing. They decided to watch workload on their engagement tool. They actually set an OKR for helping employees with well-being. But we realized, of course, to that earlier point, that engagement and satisfaction is not a proxy for well-being, right? We need additional measures. So we did the well-being pulse with them. And of course, data and analytics, they loved having data and measures for how we're doing. In the feedback surveys, that was a high point. And we were able to have team well-being labs across the organization. I think we had about 15 to 20 in 1 year, right, across teams. And then we had a snapshot of how the organization was doing. So we could look at the number of people that were at burnout risk. This was anonymous, but the number of people at burnout risk, those that were in the sprinting zone, which resources are really promoting a sense of thriving, which of those job demands we need to keep an eye on. And this helped them to capture their own best practices, to learn from bright spots across the organization about what's working well to manage team well-being. And then they also were able to look at those team resilience competencies. So, for example, resource allocation and building high quality relationships was an area that they really needed to focus on. And so then organizationally, we could take more of a systems level approach to supporting those things. So I worked with their HR leader and their agile coaches on making sure that those were on the radar. And then even the leadership team of this organization has done a well-being pulse. And this helps to prompt deep discussions about what they're doing as role models, which is also highly important.
Wow. What would you say the highlight success statement for this case study is?
I think that what came out of this was equipping teams to be having these conversations on an ongoing basis, and also highlighting that small things really do make a difference. For example, when we looked across the teams with the highest well-being, they all practiced something that research on remote teams is underscoring, called structured, unstructured time, right? Where do we create moments for a 30-minute coffee chat once a week? Optional. Do we spend time in our team meetings talking about wins, or spending time building relationships within working hours, right? Not adding to those. Just these really small practices that teams could say, hey, this is working for us. Let's protect it. I think that was a great takeaway for them, and something that other teams could easily adopt.
Yeah. Wow. And I love one of the key things that you said right out of the gate was talking about these things. I think we don't talk about these things. Well-being and burnout can be such a lonely thing because you feel like you're the only one. And I feel like when you approach it from the lens that you're doing within these organizations, people realize they're not alone. There is an environmental contributor to it. And we as a team can redirect the course.
We have to. The primary cause of burnout was unmanageable workload, not feeling as though we have a sense of control. Since the pandemic, it's been relationships, a sense of community, loneliness. So we have to focus on that. And I do want to highlight, though, that teams need to do this responsibly. You do need to have a certain level of psychological safety to be having these conversations. So prior to doing one of these labs, I always do a pulse on the team's level of psychological safety to make sure that they've got enough in play, enough of a safe space. And it also means that sometimes post-workshop, there's a bit of coaching with leaders to work on a particular stressor or challenge. And that coaching part can be really transformational for helping the team to sustain the practices and the conversation.
Yeah. And I was going to ask you that what is kind of a first step for listeners who feel like they want to do something proactive to change the culture around well-being? Obviously, one is that psychological safety and trust, but what would be something that they could do besides, of course, bringing you in to do this team well-being lab? What is something that they could do internally?
You got to put your own oxygen mask on first, right? I know that that's so overused, but we've got to put our energy in that first circle so that we have more capacity to help our team members. These are skills like your own emotional regulation, being mindful of being a positive energizer on your team, right? That's where you've got to start with yourself. Then you can go kind of poco with one-on-one relationships. So for example, your check-ins. I think that your one-on-ones as a manager, right, with your direct reports are your most impactful management tool. And this is where you're bringing listening skills and compassionate responses and checking in on people's well-being. This is so important. Gallup, for example, has been researching this data point. My manager or organization cares about my well-being. And it reached a 20-point high in May of 2020. So managers were like, oh, I'm going to check in on how you're doing and offer some flexibility.
And doing it remotely, I think all of a sudden people realize I'm not seeing you too. So that makes it even more challenging because behind a screen, we can hide things.
But what's so beautiful is that moment afforded people to really feel this care. Almost half of people strongly agreed that they felt supported by their organization or manager for their well-being. What is so striking, and I had a conversation with Jim Harder, Gallup's chief senior scientist, about this. 2 years later, May 2022, it reached a 20-year low. My manager cares about my well-being. So what happened? His hypothesis at the time when I had a conversation with him was that it's not that managers care less, it's that employees now expect them to care. The expectation that my manager should care about my well-being has drastically changed over the last 3 years. So that just gets back to using those one-on-one check-ins in that time really well. And then I would say that leaders take a look at the team, right? Do we have space to build team relationships? Do we have opportunities to track progress on team health using the metrics that our organization already has? So I would look at those ripples, starting with themselves first.
And I think we forget about that. How we show up really impacts others' energies. That's one small thing we can do right when whether it's literally or figuratively walk in the door or turn on our Zoom. What are we doing energetically? Because it's contagious.
There's research, for example, that an MBA coach's optimism is a reliable predictor for the optimism and resilience of the entire team. My friend in the math program, Margaret Greenberg, has done research on this emotional contagion effect as well, and found that leader's mood can spread in as little as 7 minutes. Now, I want them to do this research on remote teams. That's for in-person teams. But yeah, and it doesn't mean being a crazy extroverted American or like a labradoodle, right? It's just, do you feel a little bit more positive after interacting with this person, right? It could be gratitude, hope, awe, care, a little bit of joy, of course, but just a small uptick.
Yeah. 2 more questions around this. One question is, what is a red flag that people can be looking out for in terms of, burnout could be quite close for whether it's this individual and or team?
Spoiler alert, these are the 3 signs of burnout: exhaustion, cynicism, and a feeling of inefficacy. Interestingly, for women, burnout tends to manifest most as emotional exhaustion. So looking for if someone's saying, I'm having trouble sleeping, I'm getting a lot of headaches, I just don't know how to manage everything I have going on, that's a sign that emotional exhaustion might be at play. Interestingly, for men, burnout tends to manifest more as cynicism, right? So it's those feelings of kind of, what's the point of this anyway? And one of the red flags there for cynical behavior is when people they're isolated, they're withdrawn, they're closed off. They might be irritable, frustrated. People aren't reaching out for help or collaborating like they used to. So those are 2 signs. And then It's less of a symptom, let's say, but that feeling of inefficacy, right, is when people feel lower levels of competence, or maybe they're more sensitive to feedback. So the red flags to watch out for: intense expressions of emotional fatigue, a sense of inefficacy, perhaps withdrawing, and this sense that maybe people feel as though they're incompetent, right? They don't feel as though they have an opportunity to master, to grow, or they're not taking the feedback that you're giving them.
Yeah. Well, and now in the spirit of positive psychology, we can't end this on what are the red flags. Give me one green flag that well-being is thriving.
Well, we know that the number one predictor of team resilience, the strongest competency, is that we trust one another. So if I have that data point for a team, I know that anything is possible with them. So that's the green flag I look at from a data perspective. And then, if I don't have that data, I would just look at how open and curious is a leader to role modeling some of these practices themselves. That is a great sign for a team when the leader takes their own well-being seriously. It doesn't mean that they need to be a paragon, right, or thriving, but it does mean that they give themselves and others permission to focus on this and to get better.
Yeah, I love that. Oh, those are wonderful, wonderful flags for people to be aware of on both sides of the field. Yeah. All right. Wrapping up, what is one thing that you do every single morning to set your day off on the right path?
I'd love to say that I wake up and I meditate. Funnily enough, I'm headed in a few weeks to Plum Village in France, which is Thich Nhat Hanh's village. And I've been there before for a meditation retreat. I'm going back. What I noticed when I went there, though, for the first time, was that they have this rule that you don't speak until after breakfast. And my first time there, I was like, oh my gosh, I'm not a grump. I just need quiet before breakfast. To be honest, my magic morning is one where my kids are off to school on time without 5 outfit changes and maybe even a few minutes of piano practice. But here's the thing. Here's the reason why I think it's okay to be a contrarian. In positive psychology, we learn about the peak end rule, the idea that we judge an experience largely based on how we felt at its peak moment and its end rather than the total sum. So why don't we focus on the end of our days just as much as these beautiful mornings? And so one thing I like to do, it's these 1 line a day journals. So I have one in my kids' rooms. When I remember, we'll capture just a small story of something good that happened. For myself, though, one of my top strengths is love of learning. So I try to capture something that I've learned from the day as I close my workday. And that is my favorite little moment to close my day, the end.
I love that. And thank you for turning the question on its head. That's a great answer. So thank you. So now we always leave our guests with what is the one big takeaway that you hope that our listeners leave with today?
It's not something we've talked about, but I might add this as a cherry on top, if you will, to the conversation, because many of the leaders listening are likely working with coaches, right? And we know that in our work with coaches, we often surface some of our core values and beliefs about the ways we should lead or the ways we should manage teams or what well-being at work should look like. And my takeaway or hope would be that if you're working with a coach or not, know some of your implicit rules or assumptions about managing your own well-being, managing stress, the importance of prioritizing your own well-being. As I mentioned before, I had this belief that I can't ask for help, right? Others might have a belief of I must have all the answers, or strong people don't ask for help, or well-being is not a topic to have in the workplace. So I encourage leaders to get a little bit curious about what some of their core values or beliefs about well-being are.
Yeah, do a self-inventory.
Yeah, because if we're going to have a shared responsibility for well-being, if we're going to make this mindset shift that well-being is an essential leadership and team capability, then we need to surface some of those beliefs before we can have the actions that support them.
So speaking of mindset shifts, what is one mindset shift that you hope our listeners take away?
I'll keep it brief with this one, that we have a shared responsibility for our well-being and the well-being of our colleagues and our teams.
Excellent. And conversations are great. And I love getting to chat with you, but I want to make sure that our listeners leave with an action. What is one action that they can plug and play today?
Tell your team one thing you're doing to prioritize your own well-being and let them know how they could support you.
Again, role modeling and then also accountability.
100%, right? You need people to know what's a priority for you. You also, the fish doesn't know when the water's dirty. You need someone to knock on your fishbowl and say, hey, are you maxed out? Are you nearing burnout? Or what are you doing to prioritize some of those things that you told me were important for your own well-being at work? We can't expect people to be mind readers. So building our own network of support by being clear about what's important to us is where we have to go first, right? As I mentioned before, when you're real about what you're doing yourself, then you can give people implicit or explicit permission to be doing it for themselves as well.
All right. Final question. What's possible when people look at well-being as a team sport?
More great days at work, higher impact, and it boosts our ability to adapt to change, which I know everybody is grappling with.
Yeah. I am sure our listeners are going to want to find you. And on the Silicon Valley Change website, you will see Giselle's bio. You will also see on our team engagement page more information on the Team Wellbeing Lab. Giselle, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate the conversation and having you in my life. So thank you. Thank you to everyone at home or on the go for listening. If you find this show meaningful, please hit that follow or subscribe button. It helps more people find what's possible organically. If you have questions about anything we've talked about, please drop me a line at podcast@svchange.com. I read every email I get, whether that's an episode idea, a guest recommendation, or just a simple note about how the show has impacted you. I'd love to hear from you. I'm Eileen Schaefer, and I'll see you on the next episode.